Sometimes a man loses everything before he finds what he was meant to hold on to. For 55-year-old Boyd Voss, that moment came when he and his son Declan pulled up to a lonely cabin at the edge of a snow-covered forest. They'd been driving for days with nowhere to go when they saw the sign, "Caretaker Wanted." The cabin had smoke rising from the chimney and a fire burning inside, but nobody was home. On the table sat a letter addressed to the one who stayed. It was written by a man who'd lived there alone for decades after losing his family. He left the cabin behind for someone ready to start over. But why did he leave so suddenly, and what was he running from? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, subscribe, because tomorrow I've saved something special for you. The truck's engine ticked as it cooled, the only sound besides the wind moving through the pines. Boyd Voss sat with his hands still gripping the steering wheel, staring at the cabin through the dirty windshield. Beside him, his son Declan had already opened the passenger door, letting in a gust of cold air that smelled like snow and wood smoke. "You coming?" Declan asked, his voice carrying that flat tone Boyd had grown accustomed to over the past 6 months. Not quite hostile, but not warm either. Just words, stripped of everything that used to connect them. Boyd nodded and climbed out, his knees stiff from 3 days of driving. He was 55 years old and felt every year of it lately. The layoff had done that, taken a man who once stood straight and turned him into someone who moved like he was apologizing for taking up space. They'd left Indianapolis with 2 duffel bags, a toolbox, and $800 between them. The foreclosure notice had given them 30 days, but Boyd couldn't stand to watch strangers pick through Maureen's things at an estate sale, so they'd left early. Declan had been sleeping on his couch for 4 months by then anyway, after his own landlord had raised the rent beyond what his warehouse job could cover. Father and son both unmoored, both pretending they had a plan. The hand-painted sign leaned against a post at the edge of the clearing. "Caretaker Wanted. Inquire within." The lettering was careful, the work of someone who took time with things. Boyd had spotted it from the main road, barely visible through the trees, and something in his chest had pulled him toward it. "Smoke's coming from the chimney," Declan said, moving toward the cabin. He was 32, tall like his mother had been, with her dark hair and serious eyes. "Someone's home." But when Declan knocked, there was no answer. He knocked again, harder, and the door drifted open under his knuckles. It hadn't been latched. "Hello?" Declan called into the dim interior. "We saw the sign. We're looking for—" He stopped. Boyd came up behind him and looked over his shoulder into the cabin. The fire was burning steadily in a stone fireplace, casting orange light across a simple room. A kettle sat on a wood stove, still steaming. The furniture was old but well maintained. A worn sofa, 2 chairs, a table made from thick planks. Bookshelves lined one wall, crowded with volumes that looked like they'd been read many times. Everything was tidy, organized, cared for. But there was no one there. "This is weird," Declan muttered. "Fire doesn't light itself." Boyd's eyes went to the table. A single envelope sat there, propped against a ceramic mug. Even from the doorway, he could see the writing on the front. "To the one who stayed." They stepped inside together, and Declan closed the door against the cold. The warmth of the fire felt like an embrace after so many nights in the truck, after so many weeks of cheap motels and rest-stop parking lots. Boyd crossed to the table and picked up the envelope. The paper was thick, quality stock, and the handwriting was elegant, the cursive of someone educated in an earlier time. "Should you open that?" Declan asked. "It's not addressed to anyone specific." Boyd turned it over. The envelope wasn't sealed, just tucked closed. He pulled out 2 pages of the same heavy paper, covered in the same careful script. "What's it say?" Boyd unfolded the pages and began to read aloud, his voice quiet in the stillness of the cabin. "To the one who stayed. If you're reading this, you've done something I could not do for 30 years. You've chosen to begin again in a place that holds someone else's sorrow. That takes a kind of courage I respect. My name is Oswald Briggs. I built this cabin in 1962 with my wife, Constance, dreaming of the life we'd have here with our daughter, Iris. We had 3 years of happiness in these walls. 3 years of laughter and morning coffee and evening fires. 3 years of the kind of peace a man spends his whole life searching for. And then, on a January night in 1965, that peace ended. An icy road, a moment of lost control. I was driving. They were gone before the ambulance arrived. I survived without a scratch. Isn't that something? Not a single broken bone, while my whole world shattered. I've lived here alone ever since, trying to understand why I was spared, trying to find meaning in the aftermath. Some days I thought I'd found it. Most days I simply existed, moving through routines that kept me tethered to the world. I made this place a refuge, not just for myself, but for the land, the trees, the creatures that don't judge a man for his failures. I learned to live with my ghosts. I learned that isolation can be both a punishment and a strange kind of grace. But I'm old now and my heart is tired. The doctor in town has given me words I won't repeat here because they don't matter. What matters is this. I'm leaving before winter takes the choice from me. I'm going on my own terms, to a place I've chosen, to meet whatever comes next with my eyes open. And I'm leaving this cabin to you, whoever you are. The caretaker I've been searching for. The person who needs what I needed 30 years ago. A place to stop running. A place to face what must be faced. A place to begin again. The work is simple. Keep the fire burning. Maintain the property. Respect the land. You'll find instructions in the journal by the bed. Everything you need is here. I don't know your story, but I know you have one. Everyone who finds this place does. This cabin calls to people who are carrying too much. People who need permission to set something down. Consider this your permission. The past cannot be changed. I learned that the hard way, but how we carry it forward, that's up to us. I chose to carry mine alone, and while I don't regret it, I wonder sometimes what might have been different if I'd let someone help. Don't make my mistake. Whatever you're carrying, you don't have to carry it alone. Welcome home. Oswald Briggs. The silence after Boyd finished reading stretched long and deep. He folded the letter carefully, his hands not quite steady, and set it back on the table. Declan had moved to the window and stood looking out at the darkening forest. "He's dead," Declan said finally. "That's what he's saying. He went somewhere to die? Maybe. Definitely." Declan turned from the window. His face was hard to read in the firelight. "And he left all this to whoever showed up. To us. To whoever stayed," Boyd corrected quietly. "Same thing. I don't think it is." They stood in the warm cabin, 2 men who'd been strangers living in the same house for months, each wrapped in his own private grief and failure. Boyd thought about the letter's words, about carrying too much, about the courage to begin again. "There's more," Boyd said, gesturing to a doorway that led deeper into the cabin. "Bedroom, I'd guess." "And he mentioned a journal." Declan didn't move. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking it's getting dark. I'm thinking it's cold outside. I'm thinking we have nowhere else to be, so we just, move into a dead man's house?" He offered it. Boyd looked at his son, trying to find something in Declan's face that looked like the boy he'd raised. "1 night. We'll stay 1 night, and in the morning we'll figure out what to do next." Declan's jaw worked like he was chewing on arguments, but finally he nodded. 1 night. Boyd woke to pale light filtering through unfamiliar windows and the sound of an axe biting into wood. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was. The ceiling beams above him were rough-hewn pine, not the textured drywall of the house he'd lost. Then it came back, the cabin, the letter, Oswald Briggs. He sat up slowly, his back protesting. The couch hadn't been uncomfortable, but at 55, every unfamiliar bed left its mark. Through the window, he could see Declan in the clearing, working methodically through a pile of logs. His son had always been an early riser, even as a child. Maureen used to joke that Declan got more done before breakfast than most people managed all day. Boyd stood and stretched, noting that someone, Declan presumably, had added wood to the fire during the night. The cabin was warm, almost cozy. He found his boots by the door and pulled them on, then stepped outside into air so cold it made his lungs ache. "Morning," Declan said without looking up. He brought the axe down cleanly, splitting a log into two perfect halves. Found the woodshed. We're low. Maybe 2 weeks' worth if we're careful. You've been counting. Habit. Declan set another log on the stump he was using as a chopping block. Place like this, you need to know what you have. Boyd watched his son work, seeing the efficiency in every movement. Declan had learned that in the army, how to assess, inventory, plan. 4 years in the service and he'd come back different, quieter, more contained. Then Maureen had gotten sick, and whatever walls Declan had built around himself had grown higher. I found something, Boyd said. In the bedroom. A journal. The axe paused mid-swing. And Oswald kept records, daily entries going back 30 years. Maintenance schedules, weather observations, repairs needed. Boyd pulled the small leather notebook from his jacket pocket. Lists of everything that needs to be done to prepare for winter. We're already behind. Declan brought the axe down, then leaned on the handle. Behind for what? We're leaving today, remember? One night we said, I know what we said, but... Boyd opened the journal to a page he'd marked with his thumb. There's another letter, tucked between the pages. Short one, like he wrote it in a hurry. He read aloud, If you're reading this, you've stayed. The work begins now. That's it? That's it. Declan pulled the axe free and set it against the woodpile. His breath came out in white clouds. What work exactly? Boyd flipped through the journal's pages, each one covered in Oswald's careful script. Roof needs patching on the northwest corner. Shutters need reinforcing before the heavy snows. Chimney should be swept. Firewood, obviously. He's got a root cellar that needs checking, a water pump that freezes if you don't wrap it properly. Foundation stones on the east side are loose. He looked up. It's a lot. For someone planning to stay. For someone who doesn't want to watch this place fall apart. They stared at each other across the woodpile, and Boyd could see his son doing calculations, practical ones about time and resources, but also emotional ones about commitment and risk, about staying in one place when staying meant confronting all the reasons they'd been running. How long? Declan asked finally. To do it right. Through winter, at least. Spring would be smarter. Make sure everything holds through the worst of it. That's 6 months. More or less. Declan looked back at the cabin, solid and waiting. And then what? Spring comes and we just leave. Let someone else find it? I don't know, Boyd admitted. I'm just thinking one step ahead. We need somewhere to be. This is somewhere the work needs doing. We can do it. We don't have money for supplies. We have some. And the journal mentions a town, Millbrook, 15 miles north. Maybe there's work there. Maybe... He stopped, hearing how desperate it sounded. How much like hope, which was dangerous for men in their position. But Declan was nodding slowly. One condition. What's that? Come spring, we leave. No arguments, no second thoughts. We do the work. We honor what the old man built. And then we move on with our lives. Boyd wanted to ask what lives those would be, where they thought they were moving on to. But he knew better than to press. This was the most his son had given him in months. A reluctant partnership, a shared purpose, even if temporary. Deal, Boyd said and offered his hand. Declan looked at it for a long moment before shaking. His grip was firm, calloused from warehouse work and splitting wood. The handshake of a man who kept his promises, even the ones that cost him. They spent the morning taking inventory. The cabin was better stocked than Boyd had expected. Canned goods in the pantry, flour and rice in sealed containers, even some dried herbs hanging from the kitchen rafters. The root cellar held potatoes and onions, though some were starting to sprout. The water pump worked, though it groaned with cold. The wood stove in the kitchen was sound. The fireplace drew well, and the roof, despite Oswald's concerns, seemed mostly solid. We'll need to go into town, Boyd said as they finished their survey. Get proper supplies, see what's available. And tell someone we're here, Declan added. Last thing we need is someone thinking we're squatters. The drive to Millbrook took 20 minutes on a narrow road that wound through dense forest. The town, when they found it, was smaller than Boyd had imagined. A single main street with a general store, a diner, a post office, and a few other buildings that might have been offices or homes. The mountains rose behind it, blue-gray against the winter sky. The general store was warm and crowded with goods that seemed to have no particular organization. A woman in her 60s stood behind the counter reading a paperback. She looked up when they entered, her eyes sharp and assessing. "Help you, gentlemen?" "Hope so," Boyd said. "We're staying out at the Briggs place. Saw the sign about caretaker work. Wanted to let someone know we're there and pick up some supplies." The woman's expression shifted, surprise, then something sadder. She set down her book and came around the counter. "You found Oswald's cabin. You knew him." Everyone knew Oswald, or knew of him anyway. Kept to himself mostly, but he'd come through every few months for supplies. Always polite, always paid cash. She studied them both. "I'm Phyllis Crawford. I run this place. Boyd Voss, this is my son, Declan." Phyllis shook their hands, her grip surprisingly strong. "When did you arrive?" "Yesterday evening. Found the cabin empty except for a letter." "So he really did it." Phyllis's voice was quiet. "We wondered. He came through about 3 weeks ago, bought more supplies than usual. Paid off his tab, even though I told him it wasn't necessary. Said he was—" She paused, choosing words carefully. "Said he was settling accounts." Declan shifted beside Boyd. "Did he say where he was going?" "No, but Oswald didn't explain himself to people. 30 years of living alone teaches a man to keep his own counsel." Phyllis moved back behind the counter. "You planning to stay?" "Through winter," Boyd said. "Place needs work. We figured we'd earn our keep." "Generous of you." There was something in her tone, not quite skepticism, but close. "You know anything about maintaining a mountain property?" "We'll learn." Phyllis nodded slowly, still measuring them. Then she pulled out a notepad. "Make a list of what you need. I'll give you fair prices. Oswald always paid fair, and I'll expect the same from anyone living in his place." They spent 20 minutes gathering supplies, basic tools, weatherproofing materials, food staples. As Boyd paid, counting out bills carefully, a man entered the store. He was older than Phyllis, maybe 70, with a face weathered by decades of mountain winters. "Gordon," Phyllis said, "these fellows are staying at the Briggs place." Gordon stopped, his hand still on the door. "That's so. Through winter," Boyd confirmed. "Huh." Gordon moved to the counter, studying them openly. "Oswald was a good man. Quiet but good. You treat that place with respect here. That's the plan. And if you see anything strange out there, you come tell me." Declan frowned. "Strange how?" Gordon exchanged a look with Phyllis. "Oswald used to talk about the woods. Said there were things moving through them that didn't want to be seen. Most folks thought he was just old and lonely seeing things. But sometimes," he shrugged, "sometimes people heard things they couldn't explain. Footprints in snow that didn't match any animal. That sort of nonsense." "Nonsense," Phyllis said firmly. "Gordon loves a ghost story. I'm just saying what I heard." Gordon touched his cap to them. "Welcome to Millbrook. Hope you last longer than most." The drive back to the cabin was quiet. Boyd noticed Declan checking the mirrors more than usual and found himself doing the same. The forest pressed close on both sides of the road, dense with shadows, even in daylight. They were almost home. Boyd caught himself thinking the word and pushed it away when Declan braked suddenly. "What?" "Look." Declan pointed to the side of the road, where their tire tracks from the morning were still visible in the patches of snow. Crossing them, cutting perpendicular toward the cabin, was another set of tracks. Bootprints, human-sized, fresh enough that the edges were still sharp. Someone had followed their path, or had been there waiting, watching them leave, and had moved closer to the cabin once they were gone. Boyd and Declan looked at each other, the same thought passing between them without words. They drove the last quarter-mile faster than the road warranted, pulling into the clearing with gravel spraying. The cabin looked exactly as they'd left it. Smoke still rose from the chimney. Nothing seemed disturbed. But when they climbed the steps to the porch, they both saw it. A fresh set of boot prints in the dusting of snow, leading right up to the door, then veering off toward the woods behind the cabin. Someone had been here. Someone had stood on this porch, maybe looked through the windows at their belongings inside. Someone was watching them. That night, as they sat by the fire with the doors locked and ears tuned to every sound the forest made, Boyd opened the journal again. Near the back, he found an entry from just 2 months earlier, The guardian is restless again. I left food at the usual place. Sometimes I think he's the only one who understands what it means to be haunted. We're the same, he and I, ghosts among the living, trying to find our way back. Boyd showed the passage to Declan, who read it twice before speaking. So someone was out here with him. Someone he was helping. Looks like. And now they're watching us. Maybe. Boyd stared at the fire, thinking about the tracks, the warning from Gordon, Oswald's cryptic words. Or maybe they're deciding if we're worthy of staying. Outside, something moved through the darkness between the trees. Neither of them mentioned it, but neither of them slept well that night, and when morning came, they began the work of making the cabin secure with a new urgency, not just against winter, but against whatever else was out there, watching and waiting in the snow. The first 2 weeks passed in a rhythm of work that left both men too exhausted to do much besides eat and sleep. Boyd's body remembered labor. His father had been a carpenter, and Boyd had spent summers as a teenager framing houses. But 30 years behind a desk had softened him. Every morning, he woke with new aches, new reminders of his age. Declan worked with the steady efficiency of someone who needed to stay busy, who couldn't afford to let his mind wander. They patched the roof, reinforced the shutters, split enough wood to fill the shed twice over. The physical exhaustion was almost a relief. It left no room for the questions that had been following Boyd for months. What now? What next? How did a man start over when everything that defined him was gone? It was on a grey afternoon, while searching for a pry bar in the small workshop behind the cabin, that Boyd found the wood-carving tools. They were tucked in a wooden box on a high shelf, wrapped in oiled cloth. 6 chisels of varying sizes, 2 small knives, a mallet worn smooth by use. Boyd lifted one of the chisels, testing its edge against his thumb. Still sharp. Oswald had maintained them carefully. Beside the box was a collection of carved figures, birds mostly. A hawk with wings spread, a sparrow perched on a branch, an owl with eyes that seemed to follow movement. Each piece was remarkably detailed, the wood grain incorporated into the design rather than fighting against it. Boyd turned one of the carvings over in his hands, feeling something shift in his chest. He'd forgotten. God help him, he'd completely forgotten. His father had taught him to carve when he was 12. Winter evenings at the kitchen table, Russell Voss's patient hands guiding Boyd's, showing him how to read the wood, how to let it tell you what it wanted to become. Boyd had loved it. The smell of fresh-cut cedar, the quiet concentration, the satisfaction of revealing something beautiful from a rough block. But then college, then the job, then marriage and Declan and the endless wheel of responsibility. The tools had gone into a box, then into a closet, then into storage, and eventually he'd stopped thinking about them entirely. Stopped thinking about that version of himself who'd made things with his hands just for the joy of it. "Find the pry bar?" Boyd turned to see Declan in the workshop doorway. He held up the chisel instead. "Oswald carved," he said, hearing the thickness in his own voice. Declan stepped inside, looking at the tools, the finished pieces on the shelf. "They're good." "Really good?" "Yeah." Boyd set down the chisel carefully. "I used to do this. Long time ago. I didn't know that. No reason you would. I stopped before you were born." Boyd picked up the hawk, studying the precise way Oswald had captured the curve of feathers. "My father taught me. His father taught him. I was supposed to teach—" He stopped. The unfinished sentence hung between them, heavy with all the things Boyd had meant to do, meant to share, meant to be. "You could start again," Declan said quietly. "Doesn't seem like Oswald would mind." That evening, after dinner, Boyd sat at the table with a piece of cedar he'd found in the workshop and the smallest of the chisels. His hands felt clumsy at first, uncertain, but slowly muscle memory returned. The angle of the blade, the pressure needed, the way to work with the grain rather than against it. He didn't try anything ambitious, just practiced basic cuts, relearning the language of the wood. Declan sat across from him, pretending to read Oswald's journal but mostly watching. Neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the fire crackling and the soft scrape of blade on wood. Over the next week, carving became Boyd's evening ritual. While Declan read or studied maps of the property, Boyd worked on small projects, a simple bird, then a better one, then a fox. The pieces weren't as refined as Oswald's, but they improved each night. More importantly, the work quieted something in Boyd's mind that had been screaming for months. It was Declan who made the first discovery during one of their wood-gathering trips. They'd ranged about half a mile from the cabin, following a deer path that wound through dense pines, when Declan stopped and pointed. There, hanging from a low branch, was a carved wooden bird, weathered by seasons but still recognizable, a blue jay, its crest detailed even after years of exposure. Boyd lifted it carefully from its perch. The carving was Oswald's work, no question. But why hang it here so far from the cabin? There's another one, Declan said, moving deeper into the trees. They found 5 more over the next hour, scattered through the forest like markers. Each one was different, a cardinal, a chickadee, a crow. Each one hung where it could catch light filtering through the canopy, visible to anyone who knew to look. He marked a path, Boyd said, turning back toward the cabin. From here, he could just make out the next bird, and from that one, presumably the next. These lead somewhere, or they're just decorations. Old man living alone, maybe he wanted company, but Boyd didn't think so. There was intention in the placement, too much care in the spacing. These birds were trying to tell them something. That night, Boyd added an entry to the notebook he'd started keeping, his own journal, separate from Oswald's. He wrote about the birds, the tools, the strange sense of following in the footsteps of a man he'd never met, but was beginning to understand. The morning after that, Declan surprised him. They were eating breakfast, oatmeal and coffee, the same thing they'd had for 2 weeks, when Declan cleared his throat. "Show me," he said. "Show you what?"
"How to carve."
"If you're going to sit there every night making things, I want to learn." Boyd looked at his son, trying to read the expression behind the request. Was it genuine interest? An olive branch? Just a way to fill the long evenings? Maybe it didn't matter. "All right," Boyd said. "We'll start tonight. Easy stuff at first, just learning to hold the tools properly." That evening, Boyd taught his son the same way Russell had taught him. How to position the wood, how to angle the blade, how to feel for the grain. Declan's hands were steadier than Boyd's had been at first. Soldiers' hands, trained for precision. "Like this?" Declan asked, making a careful cut. "Little shallower. You're not trying to dig, you're trying to reveal. The shape's already in there. You're just taking away what doesn't belong." Declan adjusted his grip and tried again. This time the shaving curled off cleanly.
Better.
Better. They worked in comfortable silence, father and son, in a cabin that had once held another father's grief. Outside, the temperature dropped, and the first real snow of the season began to fall soft and steady. Inside, by the fire's warmth, 2 men who'd forgotten how to talk to each other found a different kind of language. Later, as Boyd lay on the couch waiting for sleep, he heard Declan moving around the bedroom. Then his son's voice, quiet but carrying in the stillness. "Dad." "Yeah?" A pause. "Thanks for teaching me." Boyd's throat tightened. "You're welcome." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. But it was something. A crack in the wall that had been standing between them for so long. A small opening where light might eventually enter. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the tracks that had been haunting them, erasing evidence of whoever was watching. But Boyd found he minded less now. The cabin felt less like a refuge from something, and more like a place where something could begin. In the workshop, Oswald's tools waited in their box, ready to teach their lessons to new hands. On the shelf, the wooden birds kept their patient vigil. And in the forest, more birds hung from branches, marking paths through the darkness, leading to places not yet discovered. The work, as Oswald had written, had begun. The snow that had started as gentle flurries became a proper winter storm, lasting 3 days. Boyd and Declan were confined to the cabin, watching the world outside disappear under white. They'd prepared well enough. The woodshed was stocked, the pantry full, the windows sealed against drafts. But the isolation pressed in on them in ways the work had kept at bay. On the second day, restless and tired of reading, Boyd decided to properly clean Oswald's bedroom. They'd been sleeping there in shifts, Declan taking the bed one night, Boyd the next, but neither had done more than change the sheets. The dresser drawers remained full of Oswald's clothes. The closet still held his jackets, and the nightstand was cluttered with the accumulated objects of a long, solitary life. Boyd started with the nightstand, sorting carefully. Reading glasses, a pocket watch that had stopped years ago, a small stone that had been worn smooth by handling, and then, pushed to the back of the drawer, a wooden music box. It was beautifully made, walnut with inlaid maple leaves on the lid. Boyd lifted it carefully and wound the key on the bottom. The mechanism was stiff but functional. When he opened the lid, a simple melody played, a lullaby, sweet and melancholy. Inside, tucked into the velvet lining, was a photograph. The picture showed a young family, a man in his 30s who was recognizably Oswald, a pretty woman with dark hair and kind eyes, and a little girl, maybe 4 years old, laughing at something beyond the camera's frame. On the back, in faded ink, "To Oswald, all my love, Constance. Christmas 1963. 2 years before the accident. 2 years before everything ended." Boyd sat on the edge of the bed, holding the music box as it played its sad little song. He thought about Maureen, about the photographs he'd packed so carefully before the foreclosure, about the weight of carrying someone's memory forward when they couldn't carry it themselves. "Dad?" Declan stood in the doorway. Boyd hadn't heard him approach over the music. "Found this," Boyd said, holding up the box. "His family." Declan crossed the room and took the photograph, studying it for a long moment. "They look happy." They were. And for a while, and then he spent 30 years alone in the woods. Declan handed back the photo. "That's one way to grieve, I guess." "Is it?" Boyd met his son's eyes. "Or is it just one way to stop living?" The question hung between them, sharp-edged and dangerous, because they both knew they were talking about more than Oswald now. Declan sat down in the chair by the window. Outside, snow continued its steady fall. "Mom died 8 years ago." "I know. You stopped living 8 years ago." Boyd wanted to argue, wanted to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. Because Declan was right. Maureen's cancer had taken 18 months to kill her, 18 months of treatments and hope and gradual surrender. And when it was finally over, Boyd had felt nothing but a terrible, guilty relief that her suffering had ended. And then he'd felt nothing at all. "I didn't know how to be both parents," Boyd said finally. "I didn't know how to be the strong one when I felt like I was drowning. So you just checked out. Went to work, came home, sat in front of the TV. You were there, but you weren't there." Declan's voice was steady, not accusing exactly, just stating facts. "I lost Mom and I lost you on the same day. I just didn't realize it until later. Declan, I'm not saying it to hurt you. I'm saying it because if we're going to be stuck in this cabin together for 6 months, we should probably be honest about why we barely talked before we got here." Boyd set the music box down carefully on the nightstand. The song had wound down, leaving silence. "You're right about all of it. I did check out. I was so afraid of falling apart that I just stopped feeling anything, stopped trying. And by the time I realized what I'd done, you were gone, and I didn't know how to reach you. I wasn't just gone. I moved 3 miles away." "You were gone," Boyd repeated quietly. "And I let you go because I thought you were better off without me dragging you down." Declan looked out the window at the falling snow. "I wasn't better off. I was angry and lost and working 60 hours a week, so I didn't have to think about any of it." Sound familiar? It did. God help him, it did. "I blamed you," Declan continued, "for giving up, for not fighting harder to keep things together. And then I did the exact same thing. Got my own apartment, kept my head down, pretended I was fine." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "We're quite a pair. Your mother would be disappointed in both of us." "Yeah, she would." Declan turned from the window. "But she's not here. And we are. And I'm tired, Dad. I'm tired of being angry, and I'm tired of pretending we're not both completely lost." Boyd felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been locked tight for so long he'd forgotten it was there. "I'm sorry for checking out, for not being what you needed, for—" His voice broke. for being relieved when her suffering ended. What kind of person feels that? The kind who loved her enough to want her pain to stop. Declan's voice was rough. I felt it too. And then I felt guilty about feeling it, and angry at you for probably feeling it. And it all just got twisted up until I couldn't look at you without remembering everything we'd lost. So what do we do now? I don't know. But maybe we start with not lying to each other. Not pretending we're fine when we're not. Declan stood and moved to the door, then paused. And maybe we stop living like Oswald did, alone in the woods, carrying everything by ourselves until it crushes us. After Declan left, Boyd sat with the music box for a long time. He wound it again and let the lullaby play while he looked at the photograph of Oswald's lost family. He thought about the journal entries he'd read, 30 years of a man talking to ghosts, apologizing to empty air, trying to make sense of the senseless. Oswald had survived the accident without a scratch. Boyd had survived Maureen's death, survived the layoff, survived the foreclosure. But surviving wasn't the same as living, and living alone wasn't the same as healing. That evening, they made dinner together. Nothing fancy, just pasta and canned sauce. But they worked side by side in the small kitchen, passing utensils, coordinating tasks. Small gestures of cooperation that felt enormous. Over the meal, Declan told stories about Maureen that Boyd had never heard. Things she'd said to Declan privately. Advice she'd given. Moments they'd shared when Boyd had been at work or too absorbed in his own grief to notice. Each story was a gift, a piece of her returned to him. In exchange, Boyd told Declan about the early days, before Declan was born. How Maureen had laughed at Boyd's terrible cooking. How she'd insisted on dancing in the kitchen, even though neither of them knew how. How she'd made him promise that no matter what life threw at them, they'd face it together. I broke that promise, Boyd said. You're keeping it now. They carved that night, working on separate projects but together, the way they'd been doing each evening. Declan's hands were getting steadier, more confident. He was working on a simple fish, and the scales he was etching showed real skill. She'd be proud of you, Boyd said, watching him work. Your mother. Of the man you've become. Declan didn't look up, but his hands stilled for a moment. I hope so. I know so. And I'm proud of you, too. I should have said it more. I should have said a lot of things. Well, Declan returned to his carving. We've got 6 months. Plenty of time. Outside, the storm finally broke. The clouds parted to reveal stars, scattered across the black sky like thrown diamonds. The temperature dropped further, sharp and clean. Tomorrow they'd dig out, assess any damage, get back to work. But tonight, in the warm cabin, with the ghost of a lullaby still hanging in the air and the first honest words they'd exchanged in years settling between them, Boyd allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope, not the desperate, grasping kind that comes from having no other choice, but the quiet, steady kind that comes from realizing you're not alone. That maybe, just maybe, broken things can be mended if you're patient enough and brave enough to try. In the bedroom, the music box sat silent on the nightstand, its secrets shared. Oswald's family smiled out from their photograph, frozen in a moment of happiness that had ended too soon. But their story, Boyd realized, didn't have to be a warning. It could be an invitation to love fully while you can, to forgive yourself when you fail, to remember that isolation is a choice, not a sentence, and that healing begins the moment you stop running from the people who need you most. The work, as Oswald had written, had begun. But it wasn't the work of maintaining a cabin or surviving a winter. It was the work of becoming, once again, a father and a son. 3 days after the storm cleared, Boyd found the letters. He'd been working in the small workshop, organizing tools and clearing space for a proper carving station, when he noticed the floorboard. It sat slightly higher than the others, as if it had been lifted and replaced many times. Boyd knelt and worked his fingers under the edge. The board came up easily, revealing a shallow space beneath. Inside was a wooden box, plain pine, unadorned. Boyd lifted it out and carried it to the workbench, where the light was better. The box wasn't locked, just closed with a simple latch. Inside were letters. Dozens of them, maybe 100, bound with string in neat bundles. Each envelope was addressed in Oswald's careful hand, but none had been mailed. No stamps, no postmarks, just names and dates written on the outside. To Constance, March 1965. To Iris, on your 5th birthday. To my girls, Christmas 1970. Boyd opened the first one with trembling hands. My dearest Constance, it's been 2 months since the accident. The doctor says I should write down what I'm feeling. He says it will help. I don't see how putting words on paper can help when you're not here to read them, but I don't know what else to do. The house is too quiet. I hear your voice sometimes, in the wind through the pines, in the way the door creaks. I set 2 plates for dinner before I remember. I reach for you in the night and find only cold sheets. They tell me time will make it easier. They tell me I'll learn to live with it. But I don't want to live with it. I want to die with it. I want to follow you wherever you've gone. But I'm a coward. I stay, I breathe. I watch the seasons change. And I write these letters to someone who will never read them. Because the alternative is silence. And silence will kill me faster than grief ever could. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I was driving. It should have been me. Always yours, Oswald. Boyd read through several more, each one dated months or years apart. The early letters were raw with pain, barely coherent at times. But gradually they changed. The handwriting steadied. The thoughts became more organized, more philosophical. By 1970, Oswald was writing about the land, about finding purpose in stewardship, about learning to live with ghosts instead of fighting them. By 1980, the letters included observations about birds, about seasons, about the quiet satisfaction of work done well. And then Boyd found the recent ones, dated within the last year. To Constance and Iris, I had the dream again last night, the one I've been having for months now. A man and his son driving north, looking for something they can't name. I see them clearly, the father, middle-aged and broken by loss he won't acknowledge. The son, younger but carrying his own weight of grief and anger. They need this place. They need what I needed 30 years ago, permission to stop running, permission to face what must be faced. I've been preparing for them, stocking supplies, updating the journal, making repairs. Everything must be ready when they arrive. I don't know how I know they're coming. Perhaps it's madness. Perhaps it's grace. Perhaps there's no difference. But I believe, with everything I have left to believe with, that this is why I survived. This is why I was spared when you were taken. Not to live alone forever, but to prepare this place for someone else who needs it. A father who lost his way. That's what the dream tells me. A father who gave up after his wife died, who let his son drift away, who needs to remember how to be whole. I don't know his name yet, but I will. And when he arrives, everything will be ready. Your Oswald. Boyd sat heavily on the workbench stool, the letter shaking in his hands. Oswald had known. Somehow, impossibly, he'd known Boyd was coming. Known about Declan. Known they were running from grief they couldn't face. He read through more recent letters, each one referencing the dreams, the preparations, the certainty that his purpose was to prepare the cabin for whoever needed it next. The last letter was dated just 3 weeks before Boyd and Declan had arrived. My dear ones, the dreams are clearer now. I know his name, Boyd. I know his son is called Declan. I know Boyd's father was named Russell, and that Russell carried secrets that poisoned 3 generations. I don't know how I know these things, but I trust the knowing. Tomorrow I'll drive to Millbrook one last time. I'll settle my accounts with Phyllis, say goodbye to Gordon without telling him it's goodbye. And then I'll come back here and finish preparing. The fire will be burning when they arrive. The letter will be waiting. Everything they need will be here. Tools, supplies, instructions. And these letters, hidden where Boyd will find them when he's ready. Because he needs to know this wasn't random. This wasn't accident or coincidence. This was meant to happen. He needs to know he's not alone in carrying impossible weight. He needs to know forgiveness is possible. Forgiveness of himself, of his father, of the circumstances that brought him to this place. I'm at peace with leaving now. My work is done. The cabin will care for them the way it cared for me, by giving them space to grieve, to heal, to remember who they were before loss reshaped them. Tell them, if you can, that some endings are really beginnings, that the worst thing that ever happened to us led directly to the moment they needed most. Tell them they were always meant to find this place. With all my love, until we meet again, Oswald. Boyd didn't realize he was crying until a tear fell on the page, smudging the ink. He wiped his eyes roughly and carefully returned the letters to their box, then carried it into the cabin. Declan was at the table, working on his carving. He looked up when Boyd entered, and his expression shifted immediately. "What's wrong?" Boyd set the box on the table. "I found these in the workshop, under a floorboard." "What are they?" "Letters from Oswald to his wife and daughter. 30 years' worth." Boyd sat down heavily. "He knew, Declan. He knew we were coming. He dreamed about us. About you and me specifically." Declan's hands stilled on his carving. "That's not possible. Read them." For the next hour, they read through the letters together, watching Oswald's journey from raw grief to acceptance to purpose. And finally, to the impossible certainty that he was preparing the cabin for 2 specific people who would arrive after he was gone. "This is..." Declan set down a letter and rubbed his face. "I don't know what this is. Coincidence? Delusion?" He was an old man living alone. Maybe he was just crazy? I was going to say lonely. Lonely enough to invent a purpose for himself. Boyd picked up one of the recent letters. He knew our names. He knew about Mom. He knew about my father. How could he possibly know about your father? "I don't know." But he did. And there's more. Boyd found the letter he was looking for and handed it to Declan. He mentions Russell carrying secrets. Secrets that poisoned 3 generations. Declan read the passage, his brow furrowing. "What secrets?" "I don't know." "My father died when I was 16. But..." Boyd hesitated, remembering something he'd buried for decades. "There was a night, a long time ago. I was about 10. He came home late, shaken up. His truck had damage on the front end that hadn't been there that morning. He told my mother he'd hit a deer, but he was different after that. Quieter, he started drinking more. And he never took that truck out at night again. Sold it a month later, bought something else." Boyd looked at his son. "I never thought about it much. Just a strange memory. But the timing..." He didn't need to finish. Declan's face showed he understood. "January 1965, Declan said quietly. "When Oswald's family died." They sat in silence, the implications spreading between them like spilled ink. If Russell had been involved in the accident that killed Oswald's family, if he'd been the driver who fled the scene, then everything changed. Their presence here wasn't just coincidence. It was inheritance, a debt passed from father to son, demanding to be paid. And somehow Oswald had known, had forgiven, had left them everything as an act of grace rather than judgment. Outside, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the snow gold and pink. Inside, 2 men sat with a box full of letters from a ghost, trying to understand how their broken path had led them exactly where they needed to be. The map turned up 2 days later, rolled and tucked behind the books on the highest shelf. Boyd found it while reaching for a volume on forest management that Oswald had mentioned in his journal. It was a topographical map of the property and surrounding forest, hand-drawn with remarkable detail. Oswald had marked the boundaries, labelled landmarks, noted water sources and animal trails. But what caught Boyd's attention were the symbols, small, carefully drawn marks scattered throughout the forest in no pattern he could immediately discern. Boyd spread the map on the table. Declan came to stand beside him, studying the markings. "What are those?" Declan pointed to a symbol that looked like a stylized bird. "I don't know. But look." Boyd flipped through Oswald's journal until he found what he was looking for. Here, he mentions places of clarity in one of his entries, lists coordinates that match these symbols. Declan traced the marks with his finger. "How many?" 8, spread out over maybe 5 square miles. Boyd checked the journal again. He calls them meditation spots, places he'd go to think, to find peace. Each one is marked with something, a carved bird, a stone cairn, something to identify it. We've already found some of the birds. Right, but not all of them. And according to this, there are other kinds of markers too. Boyd looked out the window at the forest, still deep with snow, but beginning to show signs of the coming thaw. "We could map them out." visit each one, see what he left there. Why? It was a fair question. They had enough work to do maintaining the cabin without going on some kind of pilgrimage through the woods. But Boyd thought about Oswald's letters, about the careful way he'd prepared everything for their arrival, and he felt certain these places were part of that preparation. Because he wanted us to, Boyd said simply. Everything else he left, the letter, the journal, the tools, they all meant something. These places will too. That evening, they worked side by side as usual, but now there was something different between them. The discovery of Oswald's letters had shifted something, opened a door neither of them had realized was there. They talked more freely now, filling the silence with memories of Maureen, with stories from their separate lives over the years they'd been distant. Boyd told Declan about the job he'd lost, not just the facts, but the shame of it. Being walked out by security, the contents of his desk in a cardboard box, 30 years of service reduced to a severance check and a form letter. How he'd driven home that day and sat in the driveway for 2 hours because he couldn't face going inside to an empty house. Declan told him about the relationships that had failed, the jobs he'd cycled through, the way he'd moved every year or two because staying in one place made him feel trapped. How he'd been terrified when Boyd called to say the house was being foreclosed, not because of the practical implications, but because it meant he'd have to face his father again. "I thought you'd be disappointed in me," Declan admitted, carefully etching feathers into the bird he was carving. "No career, no family, nothing to show for 32 years. "I was disappointed in myself," Boyd said. "You were just the mirror showing me my own failures. That's not fair to either of us." "No, it's not." They worked in silence for a while, and then Declan said, "We should make something together. Not separate projects, one thing we both work on." Boyd looked up, surprised. "Like what?" "I don't know. Something that matters. Something we can both put our hands on and say we made it together." The idea settled in Boyd's chest, warm and right. "Okay, we'll think about it." 2 days later, when the weather cleared, they made their first expedition to one of the marked locations. According to the map and Oswald's notes, the nearest site was about a mile northeast, in a clearing overlooking the valley. The hike was harder than Boyd expected. The snow was knee-deep in places, and the terrain was rough. But Declan moved with practiced ease, and Boyd pushed himself to keep up, feeling his body grow stronger with each day of physical work. They found the clearing exactly where the map indicated. A rough circle of stones had been arranged in the center, and at the northern edge, a wooden plaque had been mounted on a post. The carving was weathered but still legible. "Here I forgave myself." Boyd and Declan stood in the clearing, looking out over the valley. The view was extraordinary, mountains stretching to the horizon, the forest rolling out below them like a green-white sea. "What do you think he forgave himself for?" Declan asked. "Surviving, maybe, when his family didn't. Is that something that needs forgiving?" Boyd thought about the guilt he'd carried after Maureen died, the relief that her suffering had ended, the secret gladness that he didn't have to watch her waste away anymore. The shame of those feelings had eaten at him for years. "Sometimes," he said, "the worst thing we do is judge ourselves for being human." They stood in silence for a long time. Then, without planning it, Boyd started talking. About the night Maureen died, about holding her hand and feeling it go slack, feeling her last breath whisper against his cheek, about the sob that had torn out of him, not grief exactly, but release, and about the self-loathing that had followed, the conviction that he'd failed her by being relieved it was over. "I told myself I should have wanted more time," Boyd said, his voice rough. "That a good husband would have begged for just one more day, one more hour. But I was so tired, and she was in so much pain. And when it ended, I was glad. And I've hated myself for that ever since." Declan was quiet for a moment. "Then she told me near the end that she was ready, that she'd had a good life, and she didn't want us to watch her turn into something she wasn't. She said the hardest part was knowing how much it would hurt us." "She told you that?" "Yeah, when you were at work one day. She made me promise I'd take care of you after." Declan's voice cracked slightly. "I broke that promise. I ran instead. You were grieving too. You were allowed to run. So were you. Boyd felt something break open in his chest, something that had been locked tight and calcified for 8 years. She wanted us to be okay without her. Yeah, we're not doing a very good job of it. No, Declan agreed. But maybe we're starting to. Boyd reached out and pulled his son into a hug. The first real embrace they'd shared in years. Declan stiffened for a moment, then relaxed and hugged back, his grip fierce and desperate. "I'm sorry," Boyd said into his son's shoulder, "for checking out, for not being there, for making you carry everything alone. I'm sorry too, for blaming you, for leaving instead of staying and fighting for us." They held each other in the clearing where Oswald had forgiven himself, and Boyd felt years of accumulated guilt and anger start to loosen their grip. Not disappearing, he understood now it would never disappear completely, but becoming something he could live with, something that didn't define him. When they finally pulled apart, both men's eyes were wet. Declan wiped his face roughly and looked at the plaque again. "You think the other places will be like this? Little stations of healing? Maybe." Oswald seemed to think we needed them. He was probably right. They carved their initials into one of the stones in the circle before they left, BV and DV side by side. A record of having been there, of having faced something together. The hike back to the cabin felt easier, as if they'd left some of their weight behind in that clearing. They talked about the next location, about the project they'd make together, about the coming spring and what it might bring. That night Boyd carved, while Declan sketched designs for their joint project. A wooden bird, large and detailed, with both their styles incorporated. Something that would require both their skills, both their visions working in harmony. "We'll hang it over the fireplace," Declan said. "So whoever comes here next will know this place can heal more than one person at a time." Boyd looked at the sketch, at the care his son had put into imagining something they'd create together, and felt that unfamiliar warmth in his chest again. Hope, not desperate or grasping, but steady and sure, the kind that lasts. Outside, the first thaw began. Icicles dripped from the eaves. Snow slid from the roof in wet chunks. The forest started to wake from its winter sleep, and inside the cabin, 2 men who'd been sleeping through their own lives began, finally, to wake as well. March arrived with the slow promise of spring. The snow still lay deep in the shadows, but the days grew longer and the sun had real warmth in it. Boyd and Declan had settled into their life at the cabin with an ease that surprised them both. The work continued. Repairs, maintenance, preparation for the seasons ahead, but it felt less like survival now and more like stewardship. Boyd was organizing Oswald's desk one afternoon, sorting through papers that needed filing or discarding, when he noticed something odd about the bottom drawer. It seemed shallower than it should be, given the depth of the desk itself. He pulled the drawer out completely and examined it. There, fixed to the underside, was a thin wooden panel held in place by small clips. Boyd's pulse quickened as he worked the panel free. Behind it was a shallow compartment, and inside that compartment was a single yellowed newspaper clipping, folded and refolded so many times the creases had begun to tear. Boyd unfolded it carefully. The paper was brittle with age, the ink faded but still legible. It was from the Millbrook Courier, dated January 17th, 1965. Family killed in winter accident. His hands began to shake as he read about Constance and Iris Briggs, killed when their vehicle was struck by a dark-colored pickup truck that fled the scene. A 1962 or 1963 Chevrolet, dark blue or black, with front-end damage. Boyd read the article 3 times, his mind trying to reject what his eyes were seeing. He was 10 years old in January 1965. He remembered that winter because his father had come home late one night, shaking and pale, and the next morning the truck had damage on the front end that hadn't been there before. His father's 1963 Chevrolet pickup, dark blue, almost black in certain light. The damage Russell had blamed on hitting a deer. The truck he'd sold within a month and never mentioned again. Boyd sat down heavily, his legs no longer able to support him. His father had killed Oswald's family. had been the driver who fled, who destroyed everything Oswald loved, who carried that secret until it killed him too. And Oswald had known. "Dad!" Boyd looked up to find Declan in the doorway. He held out the newspaper clipping with shaking hands. "Read this." Declan crossed the room and took the article. Boyd watched his son's face as he read, watched comprehension dawn, watched the same horror Boyd felt reflected back at him. "Your grandfather's truck," Boyd said, his voice hollow. "He came home that night with front-end damage. I remember it, Declan. I was 10 years old, and I remember him standing in the driveway, looking at it like he'd seen the devil himself. This doesn't prove..." "It does, and Oswald knew. That's why he left us this place. That's why his letters mention my father by name." They returned to the box of letters, searching with new urgency. Near the bottom, they found what they were looking for. A letter dated just 3 months before they'd arrived, addressed simply to Boyd. Boyd's hands trembled as he read Oswald's words aloud. The letter explained everything. How Oswald had spent years trying to find the driver. How he'd eventually chosen forgiveness over vengeance. How the dreams had revealed Boyd's identity and his father's crime. How Oswald had researched and confirmed his suspicions. "I forgive your father, Boyd," Oswald had written. "And more importantly, you need to forgive yourself for being his son. You need to forgive yourself for surviving when others didn't, for being relieved when your wife's suffering ended, for not being perfect when life demanded perfection." The letter went on to explain that Oswald's nephew Felix knew the whole story, had been watching them from the woods to ensure they were worthy of the gift. That when the time was right, Felix would reveal himself. That the three of them, Boyd, Declan, and Felix, were meant to help each other carry what they couldn't carry alone. "Some endings are really beginnings," Oswald wrote. "The worst thing that ever happened to me led directly to the moment you needed most. Welcome home, Boyd. Welcome to the place where your father's sins stop poisoning your life." Boyd set down the letter, tears streaming down his face. Declan sat across from him, his own eyes red. "He forgave him," Declan said quietly. "He forgave Grandpa. He forgave us. We didn't do anything, didn't we? We've been carrying it anyway. Inherited shame, inherited guilt. We've been poisoned by something that happened before I was even born." Boyd thought about the years of feeling inadequate, of never quite believing he deserved happiness. The way he'd sabotaged his own joy, always waiting for disaster. The way he'd pushed Declan away after Maureen died, convinced he'd only hurt his son if he stayed too close. All of it rooted in guilt he'd absorbed from a father who'd never spoken of his worst moment. "The Guardian," Declan said suddenly. "Oswald's nephew Felix. That must be who's been watching us. He said Felix would make himself known when the time was right. Is now the right time?" Boyd looked at the letter again, at Oswald's careful handwriting offering absolution for sins Boyd hadn't even known he was carrying. "Yes, I think now is exactly the right time." That evening they returned to the shelter they'd found weeks earlier. This time Boyd left a specific message. "We know who you are. We know what Oswald wanted. We're ready to meet you. Tomorrow at dawn at the clearing. Please come." Boyd and Declan. They walked back to the cabin in the gathering dark. For the first time since finding the newspaper clipping, Boyd felt something other than crushing guilt. He felt possibility. That night, Boyd read Oswald's final journal entry, the one marked with a folded corner, written the day before Oswald left for the last time. It spoke of preparations completed, of Felix promised to watch from the woods, of 3 broken souls who would need each other. "Some people believe everything happens for a reason," Oswald had written. "And I don't know if I believe that. But I do believe we can find reasons, create meaning, build purposes from the rubble of our tragedies. That's what I've tried to do. That's what I'm asking Boyd and Felix and Declan to continue." Boyd closed the journal carefully. Outside, the first real thaw had begun. Icicles dripped from the eaves. Snow slid from the roof in wet chunks. The forest started to wake from its winter sleep. And inside the cabin, 2 men who'd been poisoned by inherited guilt began to understand that healing was possible. That forgiveness, real transformative forgiveness, could break cycles that had lasted generations. Tomorrow they would meet Felix. Tomorrow the final piece of Oswald's plan would fall into place. Tomorrow, 3 broken men would begin the real work of healing together. But tonight, Boyd allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in years: gratitude for Oswald's wisdom, for Declan's presence, for the strange and winding path that had led them to this cabin in the woods. The fire burned low in the hearth. The wind moved through the pines, and somewhere in the darkness, Felix waited, another wounded soul, preparing to step out of the shadows and into the light of community. The work, as Oswald had written, was about to truly begin. Boyd barely slept that night. He lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling beams, thinking about the meeting that would come with dawn. Around midnight, unable to lie still any longer, he lit the lamp and read Oswald's final journal entry again, committing the words to memory. Across the room, Declan stirred on the bed. "You awake?" "Yeah." "Me too." Declan sat up, running his hands through his hair. "Keep thinking about tomorrow, about meeting this Felix person. What if he doesn't show?" "He'll show." Oswald asked him to. And from everything we've read, Oswald was the only person Felix trusted. They tried to rest after that, but neither man managed more than fitful dozing. When the first grey light began to seep through the windows, they rose without speaking and prepared for the journey to the clearing. Boyd made coffee, strong and black. They dressed in layers against the cold, and Boyd tucked Oswald's letter to Felix, found hidden in a hollowed-out copy of Walden, into his jacket pocket. At the door, Boyd paused. "Whatever we learn today, whatever Felix tells us, remember, Oswald wanted this. Wanted us to meet him, to help him, to let him help us." The walk to the clearing took 20 minutes. The sun was just beginning to break over the mountains, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. As they approached the clearing where the stone circle stood, Boyd's heart began to pound. A figure stood near the center, backlit by the rising sun. Felix Briggs looked to be in his late 30s, lean and weathered, with dark hair pulled back and a beard that needed trimming. His clothes were worn but clean, layered for warmth. His eyes were intelligent and haunted, the eyes of someone who'd seen too much and couldn't forget any of it. "Felix?" Boyd said, stopping about 10 feet away, giving the man space. "You're Boyd." It wasn't a question. Felix's voice was rough, like he didn't use it often. "And Declan. Yes, thank you for coming." Felix's jaw worked, and for a moment Boyd thought he might bolt. But then his shoulders dropped slightly. "Uncle Oz told me you'd be different, that you'd understand what it's like to be haunted." Boyd pulled out Oswald's letter. "He left this for you." Felix took the envelope with trembling hands, staring at his uncle's handwriting. "He really did it. Left for good. Yes, we're sorry for your loss. Don't be." He was ready. His heart was giving out, and he didn't want to waste away in some hospital bed. Felix opened the envelope and began to read. Boyd and Declan sat on the stones in respectful silence, watching emotions play across the younger man's face: grief, surprise, hope. When Felix finished, he folded the letter carefully and tucked it inside his jacket. "He says I'm supposed to trust you, that the 3 of us are meant to help each other. He says it's time for me to stop hiding. You're a veteran," Declan said gently. Felix's eyes snapped to Declan, sharp and defensive. Then he seemed to recognize something in Declan's tone. "You serve?" 4 years, Army, got out in 16, Marines. 3 tours. Got out in 21. Felix's hands clenched on his knees. "Except I didn't really get out. Part of me is still there in the sand, watching my friends die while I—" He stopped abruptly. Uncle Oz was the only person who understood. He lost everyone, too. Knew what it was like to survive when you shouldn't have. They talked for over an hour in that clearing. Felix told them about finding Oswald 2 years ago, about the shelter his uncle had helped him build, about the supplies and quiet companionship that had kept him alive when he'd wanted to die. He spoke haltingly about the war, about survivors' guilt, about panic attacks triggered by crowds and noise. Boyd listened, recognizing in Felix's story the same pattern of isolation and self-punishment that had defined Oswald's life. and his own. 3 generations of men, all carrying unbearable weight, all convinced they had to carry it alone. "There's an outbuilding behind the cabin," Boyd said finally. "Oswald used to store equipment there, but it's got good bones. Could be converted into living space. If someone wanted to live there, if someone was ready to try being part of something again." Felix stood abruptly and walked to the edge of the clearing, his back to them. Boyd and Declan waited, giving him time to process. Finally, Felix turned back. "I'm not easy to be around sometimes. There are days I can't talk. Days I need to disappear into the woods." "That's okay," Declan said. "We've got our own noise. Our own bad days. Maybe that's the point. We all understand what it's like to be broken. There are conditions," Felix said. "You have to be patient. You have to let me move at my own pace. And if it doesn't work, you let me go back to the woods without judgment." "Deal," Boyd said immediately. Felix crossed back and extended his hand. Boyd shook it, then Declan. "When do we start?" "Now. Come back to the cabin with us. See the outbuilding. We'll make a plan together." The days that followed fell into a new rhythm. The 3 men worked together to clear out the outbuilding, hauling out years of accumulated debris, patching the roof, replacing cracked windows. Felix proved skilled with his hands, moving through tasks with military efficiency. But there were moments when he'd stop mid-motion, his face going blank, and they'd learned to give him space until he came back to himself. On the 3rd day of work, Felix mentioned Oswald's final wish. "Uncle Oz wanted a memorial. Nothing fancy. He hated fuss. But there's a spot on the property he loved. A hillside overlooking the valley. He carved a wooden cross and planted it there years ago. He told me that's where he wanted to be remembered." "We should honor that," Boyd said. "Invite the people from town who knew him." Over the next week they prepared. Boyd and Declan cleared a path to the hillside where the wooden cross stood. Felix carved Oswald's name and dates into the crossbeam, his hands steady despite the emotion in his eyes. They arranged stones in a circle, creating a space that felt sacred without being showy. Declan drove to town and extended invitations. Phyllis said she'd come and spread the word. Gordon promised to be there. A few others, people Oswald had helped quietly over the years, said they'd make the trip. As the day of the memorial approached, Felix grew increasingly anxious. Boyd found him the night before, sitting behind the outbuilding, his hands shaking. "I don't know if I can do this," Felix said. "Be around that many people. Make conversation." Boyd sat beside him. "You don't have to pretend anything. You just have to be present." That's all Oswald asked. "What if I have an episode? What if I freak out in front of everyone? Then Declan and I will be there. We'll help you through it or help you leave, whatever you need. You're not doing this alone." Felix's jaw worked. "Uncle Oz believed I could come back from this, but some days I think he was wrong. Some days I think I'm too broken to fix. Maybe broken doesn't need fixing," Boyd said quietly. "Maybe broken just needs company." The broken things that understand. The morning of the memorial arrived cold but clear. 8 people gathered on the hillside. Phyllis with pressed flowers, Gordon with his wife, 3 townspeople whose faces Boyd didn't recognize. Felix stood between Boyd and Declan, his shoulders rigid with tension, but his feet planted, staying. One by one, people shared stories. Phyllis spoke of anonymous cash that appeared when she couldn't afford medication. Gordon told of the night Oswald talked him through his darkest hour, sitting with him until dawn when he'd been ready to end his life. Others shared small acts of compassion, quiet moments of grace. A pattern emerged. Oswald had spent 30 years reaching out to the broken, the isolated, the desperate, not with grand gestures, but with presence, with the simple willingness to show up and stay. When it was Boyd's turn, he pulled a folded paper from his pocket, the letter he'd written to his father. His voice was steady as he spoke about Russell's crime, about inherited guilt, about the weight of carrying sins that weren't his own. "I can't apologize for my father," Boyd said. "He's been dead for almost 40 years. But I can apologize for carrying his guilt forward, for letting it poison another generation." He looked at Declan. "I spent my whole life feeling like I wasn't good enough. I didn't know why until I found out what my father had done. But Oswald knew. He knew. And instead of seeking revenge, he offered grace. Boyd read portions of his letter to Russell, forgiving him for the accident, for the years of distance, for dying before they could truly know each other, and forgiving himself for being Russell's son, for inheriting shame he'd never chosen. He knelt and buried the letter at the base of the cross, covering it with dirt and stones. Declan stood beside him, gripping his shoulder. Felix stood on his other side, silent solidarity. The three of them stood together as the others watched, and Boyd felt something ancient and heavy finally release its hold. "Oswald would be proud," Phyllis said, touching Boyd's arm, "for having the courage to face this." As the group dispersed, Boyd remained at the cross for a moment longer. He touched the carved wood, thinking about Oswald's hands shaping this memorial years ago. "Thank you," Boyd whispered, "for showing me how to be free." The wind moved through the trees like breath, like release, like the sound of something long held finally letting go. The three men walked back to the cabin together, bound now not just by Oswald's plan, but by their own choice to stay, to heal, to carry each other's burdens when the weight became too much. The work had truly begun. The days that followed Felix's arrival fell into a new rhythm. The three men worked together to clear out the outbuilding, a sturdy structure about 30 yards behind the main cabin that had been used for storage. It needed work. The roof had a few leaks, the windows were cracked, and years of accumulated debris had to be hauled out. But the frame was solid and the foundation good. Felix proved to be skilled with his hands, moving through tasks with military efficiency. But there were moments when he'd stop mid-motion, his face going blank, and they'd learn to give him space until he came back to himself. Sometimes it took minutes, sometimes longer. On the third day, as they were installing a new window, Felix spoke about Oswald's final wish. "Uncle Oz wanted a memorial. Nothing fancy, he hated fuss. But there's a spot on the property he loved, a hillside overlooking the valley. He carved a wooden cross and planted it there years ago. He told me once that when his time came, that's where he wanted to be remembered." Boyd set down his hammer. "We should do it then." "Honor his request. He wanted people there. The few folks in town who knew him said he didn't want a funeral, but he wanted people to gather and remember that he'd been here, that he'd tried to do some good. We can arrange that," Declan said. "Go into town, invite Phyllis and Gordon, anyone else who should be there." Over the next week they prepared. Boyd and Declan cleared a path to the hillside where the wooden cross stood, simple and weathered but still strong. Felix carved Oswald's name and dates into the crossbeam, his hands steady despite the emotion in his eyes. They cleaned the area around it, arranged stones in a circle, created a space that felt sacred without being showy. Declan drove to town and extended invitations. Phyllis said she'd come and spread the word to others who'd known Oswald. Gordon promised to be there. A few others, people Oswald had helped quietly over the years, said they'd make the trip. The morning of the gathering arrived cold but clear. Felix had been increasingly anxious as the day approached, pacing the property, disappearing into the woods for hours at a time. Boyd found him the night before, sitting on a stump behind the outbuilding, his hands shaking. "I don't know if I can do this," Felix said without preamble. "Be around that many people. Make conversation. Pretend I'm okay." Boyd sat beside him. "You don't have to pretend anything. You just have to be present. That's all Oswald asked, that you be there. What if I have an episode? What if I freak out in front of everyone? Then Declan and I will be there. We'll help you through it or help you leave, whatever you need. You're not doing this alone." Felix's jaw worked. "Uncle Oz believed I could come back from this. From the war, from everything I saw. But some days I think he was wrong. Some days I think I'm too broken to fix." "Maybe broken doesn't need fixing," Boyd said quietly. "Maybe broken just needs company. Other broken things that understand." The day of the memorial, 8 people gathered on the hillside. Phyllis arrived first, bringing flowers she'd pressed between the pages of a book. Gordon came with his wife, a quiet woman who kept her hand in his throughout. 3 others, townspeople whose faces Boyd didn't recognize, stood respectfully at the edge of the circle. Felix stood between Boyd and Declan, his shoulders rigid with tension, but his feet planted, staying. Phyllis spoke first, her voice carrying across the quiet hillside. Oswald Briggs was a man who understood pain. He never pretended it didn't exist or tried to make it prettier than it was. But he also understood kindness. When I couldn't afford my heart medication, an envelope of cash showed up in my mailbox. No note, no name. But I knew. We all knew. Gordon cleared his throat. He talked me through the worst night of my life. I'd lost my son, lost my way, and I was standing on my back porch with a bottle of pills, ready to end it. Oswald showed up, never did figure out how he knew I needed him. But he sat with me until dawn. Didn't try to fix anything, just stayed. Sometimes that's enough. One by one, the others shared stories. Small acts of compassion, quiet moments of grace. A pattern emerged. Oswald had spent 30 years reaching out to the broken, the isolated, the desperate. Not with grand gestures, but with presence. With the simple willingness to show up and stay. When it was Boyd's turn, he pulled a folded paper from his pocket. I never met Oswald Briggs, but he knew me. Knew my story, my failures, my need. He left me, left all three of us. He gestured to Declan and Felix, a place to begin again. He taught us that forgiveness is possible, that healing doesn't mean forgetting, and that the work of being human is the work of showing up for each other. Boyd paused, emotion making his voice rough. Oswald survived an accident that killed his family. He carried that grief for 30 years, but he didn't let it make him cruel. He let it make him compassionate. That's his legacy. Not the cabin, not the land. The compassion. He knelt and placed a carved wooden bird at the base of the cross, the first piece he and Declan had made together, wings spread as if in flight. Thank you, Oswald. For everything. We'll carry it forward. After the others finished sharing their memories, a comfortable silence settled over the hillside. The wind moved through the pines, carrying the scent of warming earth and new growth. Spring was coming, inevitable and patient. Boyd felt the weight of what he needed to do pressing against his chest. He'd been thinking about it since finding the newspaper clipping, since reading Oswald's letter of forgiveness. Some things needed to be spoken aloud, witnessed by others, made real through confession. He stood again, pulling a second folded paper from his pocket. This one was different, newer, written in his own hand just last night. "There's something else," Boyd said, his voice carrying across the circle. "Something I need to say before we leave this place." Declan looked at him with concern, but Boyd shook his head slightly. This needed to happen. 60 years ago, a man made a terrible choice. He got behind the wheel when he shouldn't have. He drove too fast on an icy road. And when his truck struck another vehicle and sent it down an embankment, killing a mother and her young daughter, he fled. He went home and lied about what he'd done. He carried that secret until it poisoned him from the inside out. Phyllis's hand went to her mouth. Gordon's eyes widened with understanding. That man was my father, Russell Voss, and the family he killed was Oswald's. The words hung in the cold air, stark and undeniable. Boyd's hands shook as he unfolded the paper he'd written. "I can't apologize for my father. He's been dead for almost 40 years, and whatever remorse he felt, he took with him. But I can apologize for carrying his guilt forward, for letting it poison another generation, for letting it infect my son." He looked at Declan, who stood with tears streaming down his face. "I spent my whole life feeling like I wasn't good enough, like I deserved every loss that came my way. I didn't know why until I found out what my father had done. But Oswald knew. He knew, and instead of seeking revenge, he offered grace." Boyd held up the letter he'd written. "This is to my father, to Russell Voss. I wrote it last night, and I'm going to read it now, and then I'm going to bury it here at the base of Oswald's cross. Because this is where forgiveness lives. This is where cycles break." He began to read, his voice steady despite the emotion churning through him. "Dad, I know what you did on January 16th, 1965. I know about the truck, the accident, the family you killed. I know you came home that night and lied to Mom, to me, to everyone. I know you sold the truck and tried to bury the truth, but it buried you instead. I'm angry at you for what you did, for driving drunk or reckless or careless, whatever the reason was, for running instead of staying, for choosing cowardice over accountability. But I'm angrier at what your secret did to our family. How it poisoned you, made you distant and sad and ultimately unreachable. How that poison seeped into me, made me feel unworthy of love and success and happiness. How I passed it on to my own son, perpetuating a cycle of inherited shame that neither of us understood. That ends now. Oswald Briggs, the man whose family you killed, forgave you. He spent 30 years learning how to let go of anger and hatred. And in the end, he gave his home, his refuge, his life's work to your son and grandson. Not as punishment, but as liberation. So I'm choosing to forgive you too. Not because you earned it or deserved it, but because carrying your guilt is killing me the same way it killed you. I forgive you for being human and flawed and weak in your worst moment. I forgive you for the years of distance between us. I forgive you for dying before I could know you. And more importantly, I forgive myself for being your son, for inheriting your shame without knowing it, for letting it shape my life in ways I'm only now beginning to understand. I choose to honor what was good in you. Your skill with your hands, your quiet strength, your love for your family even when you couldn't express it. And I choose to leave here the guilt that was never mine to carry. You did a terrible thing, Dad, but you're not the only thing I am. Your worst moment doesn't define my whole life. I'm free of you now, and I hope, wherever you are, you've found the peace you couldn't find here. Your son, Boyd. Boyd knelt and dug a small hole at the base of the cross with his hands, the earth still half frozen and resistant. He placed the letter inside, covered it with dirt and stones, and stood with his hands muddy and his face wet with tears. Declan moved to his side, gripping his shoulder. Felix stood on his other side, a silent presence of solidarity. The three of them stood together as the others watched, and Boyd felt something ancient and heavy finally release its hold on his heart. Phyllis stepped forward and placed her hand on Boyd's arm. Oswald would be proud of you, for having the courage to face this, for breaking the chain. We all carry things we didn't choose, Gordon added quietly. The brave ones learned to put them down. As the group began to disperse, making their way back down the hill, Boyd remained at the cross for a moment longer. He touched the carved wood, feeling the grain under his fingers, thinking about Oswald's hands shaping this memorial years ago. "Thank you," Boyd whispered, "for showing me how to be free." The wind answered, moving through the trees like breath, like release, like the sound of something long held finally letting go. 6 weeks passed. Spring arrived in earnest, bringing with it longer days and the gradual retreat of snow from the property. The forest came alive with birdsong and the rustle of animals emerging from winter dens. Streams that had been frozen solid now ran clear and cold, cutting through the landscape with renewed purpose. The outbuilding had been transformed. Felix's living space now had tight walls, clean windows, a small wood stove for heat, and a bed Boyd and Declan had built together. Felix still disappeared into the wood sometimes, still had days when the weight of his memories was too much. But more often now he was present, working alongside them, sharing meals, occasionally even laughing at Declan's terrible jokes. One morning Boyd received an envelope from the bank. Inside was a check, the payout from a life insurance policy he'd taken out years ago and forgotten about. Not a fortune, but enough to stabilize them, to invest in the property, to stop worrying about immediate survival. He showed it to Declan over coffee. "We could leave now," Boyd said, testing the words. "Have enough to start over somewhere else. Get an apartment in a city, look for work." Declan stared at him for a long moment. "Is that what you want?" "I'm asking what you want." "I want to stay." Declan's answer came without hesitation. "I've applied to a forestry program at the State University. It's mostly online, some in-person intensives. I want to learn how to do this right, manage land, understand ecosystems, be a proper steward of this place." Boyd felt warmth spread through his chest. "You're staying." "We're staying," Declan corrected. "Unless you're planning to leave without me." "Not a chance." Felix entered then, carrying firewood. He'd heard the conversation through the open door. "The three of us," he said, setting down the wood. "We talked about opening this place to others. People who need what we needed. Making it official." It was true. They'd discussed it on several evenings, the idea taking shape slowly. Not a formal retreat or therapy center, nothing that would require licenses or bureaucracy. Just a quiet offering, a place where broken people could come to heal, to work with their hands, to find silence and acceptance. "We'd need a sign," Declan said. "Something that explains what this place is now." Over the next week, they worked on it together. A large piece of cedar, sanded smooth and carved with words they debated and refined. Boyd did most of the carving, but Declan and Felix each added their touches, Felix's steady lines, Declan's careful lettering. When it was finished, the sign read, "The Briggs House Sanctuary for Those Finding Their Way in Memory of Oswald. Constance and Iris, welcome home." They mounted it on posts at the entrance to the property, where the old caretaker wanted sign had once hung. The three of them stood back and looked at their work, and Boyd felt the rightness of it settle into his bones. That evening, Boyd sat at Oswald's desk, his desk now, and opened a new journal. The first journal he'd kept had been filled with observations about repairs and weather, practical notes about maintaining the property. This one would be different. He wrote, May 15, 2025. "To whoever finds this place next, my name is Boyd Voss. I came here with my son Declan in the winter, broken and lost, with nowhere else to go. We found a fire burning and a letter waiting, left by a man named Oswald Briggs, who understood what we needed before we did. Oswald lost his family 60 years ago in an accident caused by my father. Instead of seeking revenge, he offered us grace. He left us this cabin, these woods, these tools for healing. He taught us that forgiveness is possible, that inherited shame can be released, that connection is the antidote to isolation. Felix Briggs, Oswald's nephew and a veteran struggling with his own demons, joined us. Together, the three of us have learned to carry what we cannot carry alone. We've learned that broken things can still be useful, that imperfect people can still create beauty, that healing doesn't mean forgetting, it means learning to live fully despite our scars. This place is a sanctuary now, for people who need space to grieve, to heal, to remember who they are beneath their pain. We don't offer solutions or easy answers. We offer work, silence, presence, and the understanding that comes from shared struggle. If you're reading this, you're probably one of those people. You're probably carrying weight you don't know how to set down. You're probably tired of pretending you're okay when you're not. You don't have to pretend here. The work is simple. Maintain the property, respect the land, honor those who came before. But the real work is internal, facing what must be faced, forgiving what must be forgiven, choosing connection over isolation. The fire will be burning when you arrive. Everything you need will be waiting, and you are not alone. This cabin has been rebuilt twice, once with wooden nails in 1962, once with forgiveness and grace in 2025. Each generation adds something, repairs something, carries forward what matters. Your turn now. Welcome home, Boyd Voss, with Declan Voss and Felix Briggs. Boyd closed the journal and placed it on the shelf beside Oswald's. 2 generations of wisdom and pain and hope, preserved for whoever would need them next. Outside, Declan and Felix were sitting by a fire pit they'd built, carving pieces for the collection they were creating, birds in flight, each one representing a person who'd found healing here. They'd hang them throughout the forest, continuing Oswald's tradition, marking paths for those who came after. Boyd joined them, picking up his tools, falling into the comfortable rhythm of creation. Above them, stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. The forest settled into its evening sounds. Smoke from the fire rose straight and true into the still air. 3 men who'd been strangers, brought together by tragedy and grace, sat in companionable silence, each carrying his own scars, his own memories, his own reasons for being here. But none of them carrying those burdens alone anymore. The cabin glowed warm behind them. The woods stretched out in all directions, patient and endless. And somewhere in the distance, if you listened carefully, you could almost hear the echo of Oswald's voice, satisfied and at peace. The work had been done. The fire would keep burning. The healing would continue, one broken soul at a time finding their way home.